Thanks very much, and first of all, thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. It's great to see everybody here, and particular thanks to our speakers. As I always said, Ruth is going to do a video. I think we're going to see a video from her, but thank you to Amanda Bosco-Kamanda, who is a trans activist and human rights defender from Uganda, and Jason Jones, who's a gay LGBTQI activist from Trinidad and Tobago, who successfully challenged the the colonial era anti-LGBTQ Section 13 and 16 of the Sexual Offences Act. My name is Johnny Oates. I'm a member of the House of Lords. I'm also the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Africa. We want to say a big thank you also to the Royal African Society, who are organising this event with Gay Times, and to SOAS for hosting us here. And also a big thank you to the Royal African Society, who provide the secretariat to the all-party parliamentary group on Africa in Parliament. One of the things that we aim in the all-party parliamentary group in Africa is to bring together expertise, as I said, both on the continent and the diaspora, to inform us and to get parliamentarians to listen a little more than they talk. So on that point, I will bring my remarks to a close rapidly, but that's very important. Parliament, obviously, in the UK, rightly, cannot change laws in other parts of the world anymore, but we do have a historic responsibility. We do have a role that we can play. We want to play that in a constructive way. We really want to understand from you how best to do that. There are a whole range. Parliament's obviously going to be dissolved next week, but when it's back in the summer, there are a whole range of opportunities to raise issues, whether that's through questions, whether it's policy changes to seek from the UK government, whether it's sanctioning individuals who are oppressing other people, whatever it is, but always thinking about how to do that in a way that is going to advance the cause and not reverse it. So we can have some discussions about some of the ways to do that as we go on. But I think that's probably all I should say at this point. I will listen with great interest and hand over to Nora.
Well, thank you so much, Johnny. And we're back. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Ruth Mungazi. Unfortunately, Ruth couldn't be with us this evening, so she sent over a video. And she also wrote an article which is in Gay Times, just giving us a brief and very succinct but engaging read on just the laws of anti-LGBTQ+ in Uganda, her experience as an activist, and the importance of media platforms like Kuchu Times in Uganda, telling the stories and giving a voice to queer Ugandans.
Hi, my name is Ruth Mungazi. I'm a human rights defender and the programs director of Kuchu Times Media Group, a media platform created by LGBTI Ugandans out of the need to have access to information that is life-affirming for LGBTI individuals, and as well to ensure that narratives about us are informed by our reality. Over the last year, 2023, Uganda enacted yet another law, the Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2023, with provisions that do not only criminalize the consensual relationships between consenting adults, but as well outlaws the provision of services to LGBTI individuals and criminalizes the sharing or dissemination of LGBTI content as promotion of homosexuality. This has set a very, very harmful precedent in terms of queer organizing, but as well signals that our country, Uganda, is very intent on erasing our experiences and voices as LGBTI people. As a global community, we each have a critical role to play in supporting the struggle for queer liberation anywhere. And I want to highlight 3 critical ways in which non-Africans can contribute to this fight. My first issue would be on visa restrictions. By imposing travel bans and economic sanctions on Ugandan officials who perpetuate hate and violence against LGBTI individuals, this will hold people accountable and send a strong signal that human rights violations will not be tolerated anywhere. It will also alert other politicians and power influencers to not look at anti-human rights legislations like the AHAP or hate speech as available tools of political ambitions and the escaping of accountability. I'll inform this by giving an example that we saw in Uganda during the enactment of the anti-homosexuality law. Our speaker and other members of parliament have continued to use the issue of anti-gay legislation to escape accountability, but as well to keep pushing for the oppression of our community. We have seen in the following weeks that followed the enactment of the anti-homosexuality law, the Speaker of Parliament came out publicly when she was asked to be accountable for well-documented misuse of resources meant for the poor. And she reiterated that people only coming against her because she enacted the anti-homosexuality law. That is a tool of escapism, escaping accountability from Ugandan citizens by using the issue of anti-homosexuality and in the long run, running up support for anti-gay rhetorics in the country. We think that governments around the world still have the power to hold our politicians accountable, even when within our country they are not able to be held accountable on such issues that continue to cost us life. It should be well understood that when politicians speak in a country like Uganda, they actually do have influence. Hate speech that we are seeing online by the Speaker of Parliament and other politicians has actually translated into actual well-documented cases of violence towards LGBT people being brutally beaten, attempted cases of castration as called for by Parliament Sarah Penty during the conversation in Parliament around the enactment of the law. And we continue to see other politicians who are preparing themselves for the 2026 election continue to drive the anti-gay conversations within local communities as tools of engaging community members. We do believe that sanctions work. We do believe that visa restrictions work. They send a strong signal to people everywhere that violation of human rights in one place shall not go unchecked elsewhere. I'll secondly come to my second issue of how Africans can engage in queer liberation is on the amplifying LGBTI stories. We must create platforms and opportunities for Ugandan LGBTI voices to be heard, unfiltered and unedited. Real stories told by queer people in their voices, speak through their true reality, must matter, must be amplified, and they must be given space to be told. This sharing of our stories and amplifying our voices, as well as providing a safe space for us to express ourselves without the fear of retribution, as threatened by the law within our country, when our stories cannot be told by entities like Culture Times within Uganda. We must have other avenues to share our stories so they do not disappear. We as well believe that we can, to reclaim our identity as queer and African, we break down the narrative that LGBTI identities or LGBTI people are an import of the West. Liberation cannot happen without self-identification. And for liberation of queer Ugandans, there must be room for narratives that affirm that we are African, we are Ugandan, we are queer, we've been here. History has documented our existence. So I do believe that by creating platforms as this is a way for us to fight back the censorship that the Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2022 seeks to do. Keep us visible, allow us to have access to your platforms, and tell our stories in their truth. Thirdly, I would say how our non-African entities can support our struggle is by supporting community-led interventions. We must trust and resource community-led initiatives that are responding to the Anti-Homosexuality Act now. Currently, we have the Convening for Equality, which is a collection of civil society organizations guided by LGBTI activists to support and coordinate responses, mitigate the implications of this law. A number of grassroots organizations within the coalition have been key in ensuring continuity in service delivery for LGBTI people in terms of health, service delivery in terms of shelters, service delivery in terms of immediate responses as paralegals, or even other bigger entities like that, responses to that law in terms of in the court. we think that by ensuring that our interventions like collectives like a meaningful quality, if they are well resourced and guided by community members who are proximate to the current issue, we will see a sustainable and well coordinated intervention this time around that will allow us to come to an outcome that clearly responds or resonates with the liberation of queer people. And I will echo this to say the focus on why it's important for us to have community-led intervention or community members, LGBTI people guide the current system structure. It is because they understand, and we've been in the struggle for over 20 years. We have a vision for where we want our community as LGBTI people, where our rights need to go. What is that strategy like? And by ensuring that community members are well resourced to lead the current interventions, we will arrive at that struggle, at that point of liberation that we're looking for. Because unless LGBT people are allowed or well resourced or given space or platform to fully engage on our rights as people, no one else can have. It would be unsustainable to assume that somebody else understands queer liberation beyond without the involvement of queer people. There's nothing for us without us. And we do believe that as people who live most proximate to the issue, we understand where we need to go. How do we navigate difficulties? How do we navigate challenges? And what is the world that we want to see as queer Ugandans? That is the role that the Convening for Equality, guided by LGBT activists, plays in the current struggle. I would like to end by saying that it is quite timely. We're at a time where it's very key right now for non-African allies to stand in solidarity with our struggle. We call you to use your privileges and resources to amplify our voices, to continue to support our work for the fight for freedom and equality. And we believe that we can create a world where all individuals can live their truth without fear of persecution if we open ourselves up and see and understand that the struggle for queer liberation anywhere is protection of human rights for all of us everywhere. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Ruth. That was amazing. So up next, I'd love to hear from you, Amanda. So Amanda is the Uganda representative for Miss Trans Global. She holds a Master's in International Development and has worked tirelessly with the UN since 2018 in different factions to help advocate for liberation across Africa. And tell us a bit more about why you're in the UK, Amanda.
Thank you for the opportunity. And to introduce myself, my name is Amanda Kamanda. I'm from Uganda, and I'm the first ever Miss Trans Global Uganda. And being here in the UK, it's an opportunity for me to continue advocating for the rights of LGBTQ people in my country. But it also comes at a time when there's a law criminalizing my existence in my country. So being here is one of the ways I can get state protection without being persecuted for who I am. And my entry in this place was also through a commitment between the UK government and the Ugandan government. So the UK government has a bilateral relationship that they have with my country through Commonwealth colonialism ties. And they have a portfolio of scholarships, the Chevening and Commonwealth, and they bring gifted scholars from Commonwealth countries to come and study in the UK for a master's degree. That's how I got here.
Amazing. So what's been your experience? Have you been back to Uganda quite often since the law, or do you sort of see the UK now as a place of refuge?
So after I won Miss Trans Global, because they had never seen any contestant from my country. They had made the record and precedent. It was risky for me to go back because I'd been outed in the media. And before that, I used to be an activist that was already doing the work. This was making it worse, that I think the government was like, this person could like a risk. And out of that, I'd started doing more visible work again with pushing more podcasts that had views. I was even in parliament as well, when all these negotiations, and it was risky for me to go back. I had to seek refuge.
I'm so sorry you had that experience. I think it rings a lot true to what a lot of people have been saying about exposure of trans and queer people. A lot of the time, exposure does not mean protection. It means you have a bigger target on your back. It means that you particularly are either held accountable for all the actions of the queer community, or you have to almost answer or fight for your existence. So it's great that you're here with us. And I know there's so many other people that wish they could be here with us, and they wish that they were also able to exist freely. But yeah, thank you for being here. I want to hand over to Dr. Owino. So Dr. Owino is a professor of feminist and security studies here at SOAS University. She's also the founding director of Feminist Centre for Racial Justice, and Dr. Owino is joining us online.
Thank you so much. So as you've said, I'm based here at SOAS. I've been here for the last 7 years, but I'm from Kenya, so I'm a neighbor of Uganda. And really the first time that the Bahati Bill came into Parliament, I was still based in Nairobi, Kenya. And one of the things that was particularly interesting during that moment for me was the coalition of actors that came together in a moment and in a region where historically work around sexuality and sexual orientation has generally been bifurcated. So where you find that folks who are doing work on questions around sex workers, for instance, queer organizers, and even feminist movements tend to work in parallel ways, and that is not even introducing organizations that call themselves human rights organizations. So if I wanted to single out one thing in relation to what it means to organize against legislation of this nature at a regional level, I think despite the negative consequences of this legal challenge that has now been put before us in its current iteration, there is something very powerful to draw from in terms of the organizing that is happening locally in Uganda, but also regionally. And I think it is worth flagging, for instance, the Constitutional Court challenge that has been put forward by various activists, including academics such as Professor Tamale and many others. The second thing that I wanted to point to in relation to what do organizations or parliamentarians or people who are part of the APPG do in situations such as this without necessarily putting their hands up and saying, well, you tell us what to do. We do not want to sort of be told that we are repeating old colonial tropes. I think one of the things that we know, both with the Bahati Bill and the current law, but across other sections of the African continent, is the reality that a lot of these resources and the mobilization that is happening for these kinds of legislations are coming from the global north. So there are a range of organized transnational actors, sometimes acting together, sometimes acting parallel to each other, that are shaping and influencing this legislation, not just on the African continent, but also across Europe. And we've seen it with the rise of a range of far-right parties that mobilize ideas around gender and sexuality, questions around gender ideology as a basis around which to organize for their political positions. So I think the task, if one is to ask what does somebody who is located here and in a position of power do, I think the place to start from is to examine and to examine the organizations that are located here, that are responsible for moving resources in ways that are quite dangerous to other parts of the world. And in this particular case, we're talking about Uganda. That is a responsibility that members of parliament can do here without being argued to be reproducing any sort of neo-colonial tropes, because what you're doing is dealing with the problem locally. The second thing that I think is absolutely most important is to provide the kinds of necessary support that allows advocacy and civil society organizations that are doing quite significant strategic litigation work across sections of the African continent to flourish, because I think that legislative challenge is absolutely important. I think there's a lot of organizing and lots of resources that exists from homegrown queer funds, but also feminist funds that are moving a lot of resources as well across the African continent to address the material questions, both of queer people, but also to strengthen queer advocacy on the African continent. So really, I do want to emphasize, deal with the problem that exists here locally, which is all of the churches, all of the organized far-right groups, all of the informal lobbies that are moving resources across to the African continent. The third thing that I wanted to emphasize is what I often refer to as the contagion effect, because one of the things that we have observed in the last decade or so is the inspiration, and I use that word very lightly, but also very sarcastically, the inspiration that other members of parliament use or get as a result of these legislations that they see in neighboring countries. So we cannot, for instance, argue that what we saw in Ghana, or what we are seeing in Ghana, what a member of parliament in my own country is attempting to do in the Kenyan parliament to sort of model Similar kind of legislation is not as a result of what I call this contagion effect. And so while we talk specifically about Uganda, there is something for all of us to pay attention to in relation to how these laws end up inspiring and generating other similar kinds of legislation, and which requires us to address the problem not just from a Ugandan perspective, but to take a continental view on how to ensure that we mobilize the right kinds of human resources, the financial resources, to deal a significant blow on the members of parliament that are generating these kinds of legislation. The fourth and final point, which I've just remembered, is again linked to this question about dealing with the canker that is at home. One of the things that several feminist academics and activists who have been studying the sort of advocacy that happens in places such as the Commission on the Status of Women, that happens annually in New York as part of the UN processes, is the level of organization that happens from the Catholic Church as well as other organizations to mobilize our members of parliament around their position on questions of gender and sexual orientation, to influence the language and positions that our governments are taking. In effect, our governments and their representatives at CSW are not taking instruction from the capital, as it's called, but you have people who are funding special sessions, flying our representatives weeks in advance to influence the language and to influence the ways in which they will argue around specific positions. So when you find inordinate debates around the removal of the term gender and replacing that with women's rights, that is not something to be happier about, because that is a strategic move that is being made to try and begin loosen up and push back against what is interpreted as the deployment of gender is really a back route, if you will, for thinking much more expansively about gender identity. So you remove gender, you place women's rights. That's nothing for women's rights activists to be happier about, because in effect, what is being targeted are gender expansive and trans comrades as a result of the removal of that language. So I think, Lord Oates, there are multiple ways, and I think two main ones are around which you can intervene at a UK level that would be very helpful in relation to these laws that we are seeing across the African continent and in this context around Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And I just want to touch on the point that you made about the groups. Linking that back to Ruth's article and the video, she made specifically there is US Evangelical Christian Movement, I think they're called, that have been lobbying in Uganda, I think, since 2018, been a lot of their time and a lot of their efforts building up to the law being passed. I think it's a point that Ruth and Dr. Uina made is there a way that government and successive American governments similarly can intervene to stop these lobbying groups, because obviously they are seen as religious movement groups. They go under the guise of missionaries, and then they use that protection that they have. A lot of it will be funds donated by public or by members of their group to then enact these laws and almost want like a boomerang effect. I remember, Lord Oates, you did an interview, I think in 2015, for the Lib Dems, and you were talking about how, as a gay man, when you came out, you found it very difficult to sort of your religion and the religious in Catholicism that you had to deal with, and being gay. And I think then nothing has really changed since you were dealing with that youth up till now, up until what we're seeing today in Uganda. Nothing's really changed. And I feel, is there a way that the UK government can intervene with these groups that set out these missions?
That's a big question. I think my case, it wasn't, I can't actually blame the Catholic Church. The Anglican Church itself was bad enough. I think we should be aware that this is religious groupings across both the Christian faith and all denominations, not just the, as you say, the evangelical churches, but the Anglican communion, which is sort of seen as liberal-ish.
Yes.
In absolutely terrible examples of what was going on. And I mean, it goes point I think that's been made, which is a specific case about Anglican bishops in Australia funds and basically offering money to church leaders in Uganda and Nigeria to basically step up and stop to liberalise sort of gay, as it were, or understanding of gay issues in the union. So that it's being very deliberately driven. Very difficult, honest answer in terms of politics, and that's why, the churches are so powerful, because people are incredibly sort of connected to them. You criticise them, and you don't just take on that issue, you take on the whole organisation.
Yeah. Sometimes the whole religion even, because you're seen as either whole religion, because a lot of it plays into politics. And I think in a country where our head of state is the king, and who's also the head of the Anglican Church, because a lot of countries want and say they have separation of church and state, but we see very heavily in Africa, you to be elected or electable, you need to be very religious. You need to be known to your local church, your mosque. You need to have the backing of religious leaders. We see that in America with Republicans, and we see that a lot in the not as much as in the UK, I think, but you do see people using in the West their religion as almost a way to win another side of the country, whether they're right wing or left wing or whichever. I think that takes us really into a point that you made. You were talking about groups. You were talking about how those groups are really important in Uganda to keep, not just Uganda, but across Africa and the diaspora, to keep the fight going on, and to keep the energy going. But I don't know about everyone, but I feel sometimes just fatigued by it all. I exist in this body. I exist as a queer person 24/7, 365. And obviously you see what happens in the news, and you feel alienated from your culture, from your people, but you also feel the need to fight as having some privilege, living in the West, but to exist in my body as free as possible. But so how do you find being able to stay active, doing the work, but also existing and having some peace of mind?
I think that's a complex question, right? And I try to be generous with the fact that at different moments, folks have to recognize the space that they need to replenish in order to be able to step out again and do the work. I think we have seen in the last two decades the kind of depletion that has happened in social movements generally and feminist and queer movements specifically in relation to this consistent battle of the consistent question really of fighting for your personhood, right? We are not simply just championing issues that are out there. We are not championing issues for other people. These are real material questions for us. And I think it is important as activists to not feel bad, to say, actually, I need to tap out now and be confident that there are others within the movement who will be ready to step up in that moment and sort of do this kind of revolving in and out, because there's no struggle that we are going to be able to sustain if we are not alive to be able to do it, right? And sometimes that social death that happens to us is not necessarily because of extrajudicial killings by the state, but because of how much toxicity we are consuming as a result of the consistent battles we're waging with state and non-state actors. So as I've grown old and more, I've become more generous with myself to recognize that I'm not the only one doing this work, and that I'm part of a community of people, and that it's important to know when I'm not able to give more, and there should be generosity in the movements that I exist in for other people to step up, and that when they're not ready to give because or not able to give, will be sufficiently replenished to be able to step back in. Yeah. And I think lots of feminist funds at this particular moment, and many queer organizations as well, are beginning to pay attention quite seriously to the question of collective care. And I'm not talking about it in the way in which it has sort of been mobilized today in a kind of neoliberal way, but I'm really talking about how we build in processes, resources, to ensure that people's mental well-being is cared for, people's physical health is cared for, the safety and security of comrades is cared for as part of how we budget for and organize our movements. It's not an afterthought, it's something we plan for, because our security is constantly under threat.
So thank you so much for that, Dr. Owino. And what we'll be speaking about activism and community. I really want to hear from you, Jason. You're an activist. You are, Jason and I met, I think, a year ago, was it? Bloomberg event. And you were telling me about all the amazing work that you've been doing. So Jason is an LGBTQ plus human rights defender, a Trinidadian, and as Lord Oates earlier, you worked, and in 2018, you won the High Court case in Trinidad to get Section 16 and 13 overturned. But shock, surprise, it's been appealed and it's gone to the JCPC.
Well, not yet. It's currently the T&T Appeal Court.
Okay.
It's 3 tiers of court. I won the case at the High Court. 2 pieces of legislation were British colonial era laws. Surprise. 13 is the Buggery Act. It carried up to 25 years jail term for adult consensual anal sex, and that could be between heterosexual couples as well. But interestingly, our government thought that wasn't enough. They thought, let's not leave the lesbians out. So they created Section 16, said between women, and that carried a penalty of up to 5 years. I challenged that law as well. Note, judge in the case, the advocate for the Attorney General said, Mr. Jones can't challenge this. He's not in possession of a vagina. And the judge said, no, we will allow it. We know what Mr. Jones is doing for his community. And, it goes back to what the doctor was saying about community work and how what we are doing has to be community-based. And it has to be looking at things not just from the perspective of mixed-race cisgender man. I also have to bring my queer sisters along with me. Yeah. So when I brought the case, it was said, you can't challenge Section 16 because you're not a woman. And I said, find a way. And my lawyers found a way. But if I wasn't tenacious enough to say, I'm not leaving my sisters behind, they would have been left behind. So the community work is a bit of a minefield. And I had a lot of pushback from activists in the Caribbean. And I'm, in fact, a bit of a pariah in the Caribbean because they said that, why are you wasting all these resources? The case has cost nearly £1 million so far, all money that I've raised myself. And they said, why are you wasting all these resources on laws that are not used against us punitively? But what people don't understand is the mere existence of a law that criminalizes the basic humanity of a person encourages the homophobia of your fellow citizens. And it was on the day of judgment that the activists who were against me in Trinidad and Tobago, and I mean against me bringing this case, especially as I live here in the UK, they said, oh my God, this is the first time I've felt free in my country. So we have to understand that work between community based in the home countries and us in the diaspora and how we work together. Tonight we have members of the Rainbow Tree from Bangladesh. We think about this on a much more global scale, and we have to marry the work the diaspora and home countries are doing. That's the key change that needs to happen that we're missing right now.
Yeah. To touch on a point about one of the courts that you mentioned was the JCPC.
Yes.
And we had a conversation earlier. You were saying actually this court is a way that Britain exerts rule over Trinidad and Tobago. And
multiple other former colonies of Britain. The JCPC is the Privy Council. It's the Supreme Court for many former colonies of Britain. We were too small to have our own Supreme Court when we became independent, so they created this court so that we could all go there. But, 60 plus years of independence, and we're still coming here. So my case, which will have effect on, that judgment will have an effect on 11 other countries. My case will be judged by a bunch of old white straight men here in Britain. Yeah. They hold the power of brown and black queer bodies in the global south. This is a situation that is shocking, and we don't hear a lot of it, especially from our parliamentarians. We need to address this situation. How are we going to get our human rights heard when we have to go 5,000 miles to our former colonizers to get justice? Yeah. So it's a bit of a dichotomy, and it's a difficult one.
Yeah. Is there anything that you can think that can address the rule of the JCPC? Because I feel like Jason said, it's quite insane to think that to get your freedom, to get to human rights, you have to basically go to your former owners on your knees begging for them to hear your cases. And as we've seen, is a lot of the what the hope is of these Christian and these Muslim and different religious groups that try to get these laws criminalised is they're sort of hoping for a boomerang effect. That it happens in Africa, happens in the Caribbean, it becomes illegal, there's death penalties all over, and then sort of the Western lawmakers see that and gravitate towards that. Is there anything that we can do to help sort of the grip of these do not represent these nations?
It is absolutely ridiculous in this that there is a court in London that still exerts power in countries which have been dependent for decades and decades. Question, of course, and I'll be in this discussion about, countries can cease to Privy Council as their Supreme Court, and they can become republics, as some countries have, and other things. So, the fundamental thing there, I don't know the sort of judgments that the Privy Council makes. I thought there's a danger that if the Privy Council made a decision that, for instance, was in favour of the position that you hold, although that would be positive on one side, it could easily be spun as these people out of touch with, they shouldn't be imposing their rules. And this is a real difficulty. That is wrong, but in a sense, I think the UK can abolish the Supreme Court of other countries, but I think there needs to be much more understanding that still goes on, because I think most people would be astonished by it.
Well, the judgments coming out of the Privy Council on human rights issues in the Caribbean have been horrendous. They overturned marriage equality in Cayman Islands last year. They have upheld death penalty cases repeatedly, citing the Savings Law clause. So, I'm concerned what they're going to come up with my judgment. We have a very strong case, but we're talking about a bunch of conservative old white men. The president of the Privy Council is an avowed Christian, and he speaks about his Christianity all the time. So you don't know what we're up against. But I think that, as you quite rightly say, people don't even know this is happening. Yeah. And that is where the conversation needs to at least begin, to say, okay, what are we going to do about this situation? It's been going on for 60 years.
Briefly, this case may be a very good opportunity. It's, in the UK Parliament, these people, how they're decided, who chooses them. Have anything to do with it in Parliament, or does it raise that profile? That's the important thing that we do. So I look forward to ongoing conversations with you about that.
Thank you. That would be great.
Yeah, no doubt. And there's something that you said earlier, Jason, just about the language that is used, and you mentioned about the Supreme Court is about Christian and always brings his religion into his judgments and into his work, which I don't know. Might be a conflict of interest. I'm not a lawyer. Don't quote me. But yeah, what you said about that was really interesting, because it kind of what Amanda said about the language that is used that comes out of these judgments, that comes out of government, that often, like you said, misses out members of our community, that puts you as an activist in a position where you're picking, do I advocate for myself and the people that look like me and live like me, or do I try to bring everyone else in? And then you will have judges or people saying to you that, well, you're not a lesbian, why do you care? Or you're not trans, why do you care? So yeah, Amanda, would you add to that?
On that point, I'd love to first of all highlight that even if we are pushing for all this jointly together as a community, we must acknowledge that there are divisions starting to rise up. You're hearing people saying LGB but without the TQ, that we should cut those people off, that they're the ones bringing all this chaos and what. It's like we're now fighting against each other.
Yeah.
And even becomes political. You'll see trans people saying controversial things, attacking their very own.
Yes.
The Republicans are saying, no, the bathroom issue, we don't want this and this. Yeah, someone was saying something like that, Yeah.
We won't name her, but we've seen her.
Mm-hmm. And I really want to echo the doctor's contagion idea. I think we don't give enough understanding and clarity of how that contagion, beginning here in 1533 with Henry VIII, the first anti-gay legislation in the world was created here in 1533 by Henry VIII, and then was spread across the world through British colonialism. But what we saw happen with the contagion is it then ricocheted back through evangelicals and Catholicism back into African and Caribbean and Muslim societies. So we've been seeing this contagion going backwards and forwards, kind of like a reverse slave trade, where, you know, as people of color, we then found this backlash of, okay, you can be black, but you can't be queer.
Yeah.
So I think that contagion idea is something that we have to highlight hugely, the historical value of it and how it works in real life today.
Yeah.
Today is the 6th anniversary of a Christian meeting that happened in central Port of Spain in Trinidad. 6 years ago, they had over 3,000 people that they bussed in from around the island to preach to them about how Jason Jones is going to bring earthquakes and plague and AIDS to the island. This was just after I had won my case at the High Court. Let me just say, 5 private jets flew in evangelicals from the United States and Brazil.
Wow.
To that meeting. We are talking hundreds of millions of dollars that they're using for LGBT fights across the global south. Hundreds of millions. But in 2018, after I won my case, Theresa May gave $5.6 million towards decriminalization work. It's a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
We cannot stop this without resources. You cannot tell religious people don't say this because they have their religious rights. They have religious freedom. So we can't fight them to stop them saying what they want to say. What we have to do is do the work. Put the resources in, educate people about what's going on, educate people about who we are. You know, we are being denied our because we don't have access to platforms. Nobody hears our stories. But you do hear the Pope, you do hear the Imam, you do hear those people because they have paid for the platforms. We need to pay the platforms.
Yeah.
We need the UK Parliament to allocate at least £100 million to this work, to fight this contagion, because they're fighting us with a lot of money. Yeah. And the only way to answer it is with the money.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think as well, you said is really rung true, to me especially, about knowing your history, about knowing what came before these colonial era laws. I think it was, so in Ruth's article talks about how in the 16th century when the first settlers came to Africa, they recorded cases of homosexuality being just normalized and usualized, queer people having families, being spiritual leaders, and the reports and they made these reports that reinforced the idea of Africans being primitive and need of a Christian cleansing. I think is what is being reinforced again in, you know, hundreds of years of us Africans specifically needing to seek some sort of cleansing or some sort of global power by adhering to Christianity, Islam, into the main religions. So I think it's definitely important. I really want to go back to everyone and just to not almost summarize, but to give everyone, you know, a takeaway from your perspective of how that we can all, whether it's writing letters, but how we can all come together to fight for Uganda and Africa's queer liberation movement.
Well, since Stonewall, what we've seen happen in the queer movement is the predominance of the gay white male. And that cisgender gay white male has dominated our activism for the globe. And Pride now has become dominated by this celebration of gay white maleness. And we don't see women, we don't see trans people of color, we don't see people of color anywhere in that forum. We are, we are seen as the bodies that we are sexualized or used in ways that are only benefits to them, not part of the structure. Out of all of the LGBT organizations, global LGBT organizations, only 2 have queer people of color in leadership roles.
Wow.
2.
Wow.
2. And one of them, Lady Phil, just left Kaleidoscope Trust to run UK Black Pride. So it's now down to 1.
Wow.
They had a black lesbian and they now put a white gay man in her place. So even move 1 step forward, get 2 steps backward.
Yeah.
So, unless you give not just a seat at the table and not just a vote, give us a table.
Yeah.
Give us a chair. Give us money to do this work. I was told by LGBT organizations here in Britain that, oh, the case will fail. Oh, they don't like you in the Caribbean, so we're not going to support you. That's what I was told. So I went off and I did it myself. Luckily, I have the background to be able to go and raise £1 million and fight a case against the government on my own.
Yeah.
But it's crazy that I had to do.
And you shouldn't have to.
I shouldn't have to do that.
It should not be all on your shoulders to
I
solve
shouldn't
the
have to do
problems
that.
of our entire
So,
community.
we need to look inside of ourselves and start looking at, who's really speaking for us?
Yeah.
They're actually doing for us. We should not have a situation now with this trans civil war. I mean, trans people have been around for decades in our movement. So somebody has created this civil war. And we need to ask, who are our leaders that have allowed this to happen? If you look at the history of Stonewall, when Stonewall was founded in 1988, they did not include trans people.
Yeah.
The white lesbian who led Stonewall at the time said, gender is not the same as sexuality, we're not involved. That's what Stonewall said. And they did not include trans people in their remit until 14 years ago. So that's planting the seeds of the transphobia within the queer community. It was planted since 1988 with the founding of Stonewall. So we need to really kind of recoup, and make ourselves more visible and make ourselves louder. We have made ourselves very small because of the racism and the backlashes that we get as minority communities within the minority LGBT community. And that's one of the things I think events like this are so important for doing.
Yeah.
It's about giving us this space and this voice and this platform, and I hope Gay Times will do more of this. And get people like Amanda to do for their magazine. Get people like Maz from Bangladesh should do a piece on what it's like to be queer in Bangladeshi and get refugee status here in the UK and then be treated like crap on the gay scene because he's a brown man. Right? These are the stories that need to be told, and we're not telling these stories effectively.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I'll begin with my previous point, because Pride Month coming up in June, we'll need more of solidarity and community.
Yeah.
And it also calls for us really working together as a team. Do you know why I'm emphasizing on that point? Because even within our own communities, the patriarchy has penetrated us socially to the point that there's the division amongst us.
Yeah.
That you see even among gay men, there'll be things that are attacking gender, and people say, I don't care, that's none of my fight.
Yeah.
It's like, if I'm to put it, it's like a string being pulled by two ends. There's one group of men that are promoting this alpha masculine toxic culture. They're like, oh, a man is this and a woman is this, and they are, they do the bottom shaming.
Yeah.
They shame people for being feminine and all this, and they're like, we don't want to encourage that sort of narrative. On the other hand, there's also a group of trans people who are being also radical in their beliefs, pushing hyper-femininity and excluding some people that so-and-so is not trans. They cannot speak on behalf.
Oh, they don't pass.
Exactly, they don't pass.
Yeah.
So, and we must admit that queer culture is like, there's that thing that is in the middle, allow to have the fluidity of being themselves.
Yeah.
But if the string is being pulled apart, then the whole GB is starting to collapse like people want,
Exactly.
So I'm calling upon like the solidarity, the terms of course, we must have gay men that are in influential positions of power. They control, some of them working donor agencies, some of them work in the media, others as leaders and all this. And they also trans people in positions of power.
Yeah.
But how are we combining our power for good as a community?
Yes.
That's what I'm calling upon.
That's perfect. Thank you. And Dr. Owino, I know you gave us 4 points earlier about how we could all mobilize and support Africa's queer liberation movement. Is there one of those 4 points you think is most important?
Yeah, I want to sort of underscore the point that Comrade has just raised earlier on about the importance of resources. The amount of money that these actors who are religious, non-religious, organized in different ways that they're mobilizing to challenge queer lives is massive. You cannot counter that work without equal resources. And this leads me to the challenge to the co-chair of the APPG. While it's a task to take on the organized religion, imagine what it means for people who are marginalized in places like Uganda or in Kenya or Ghana to do that. And I'm certain you know this. So I think there is something here for you, I was going to say us, but it's not us, for you to think about in relation to what it means to take on these institutions. however complex and complicated it is. Because this is where the resources are coming from, and it's influential in ways that we cannot imagine. And if you cannot take them on this front, who is going to do that work? Because the work that activists are doing is on their home front, challenging their governments and trying to push back against this legislation. Thank you.
And we'll hand it to you, Lord Oates. So you've heard everyone's concerns, everyone's points, everyone's ideas about how we can mobilise as a community, especially here in the UK and working with APPG for Africa. So yeah, what is your take on what our next step could be?
Well, the first thing, let me just say, I'm not saying we shouldn't challenge churches, and I haven't got a lot of, I'm doing that indeed, jumping up. Because we have bishops in the House of Lords, the established church, as Nora mentioned, we did a fair bit of work with an organisation I used to work for, investigating where all the money was coming from, for these organisations, and how to take them on. So I'm not resiling. I'm not saying I don't want to be part of that. I'm saying, I'm just being candid, it is difficult for governments to take on churches. It's hard. And it's particularly hard for them to use taxpayers' money to take on churches when many of those taxpayers are church members, and when those churches are some of the most sophisticated lobbying organisations in the world. So that is not an argument for not doing stuff, it's an argument for being well organised and very considered about it. But I was just going to say that, it seems to me from this conversation I've particularly taken is there's four issues. There's the money and resources, which is necessary. There's the media, which is, which excludes the sort of arguments that, in fact, not just excludes, but is hostile very often. There's the institutions. I've learnt just this evening more about the Privy Council than I was aware of. That's something you need to look at. And then I think there's the narrative. One of the things that I saw when I was working on issues which was actually around education, and some of the evangelical groups were doing, in fact, in Kenya, there, and we looked and traced back the money, which came from a wide range, from the evangelical churches, Catholic, sort of Spanish family groups, to the Russian Orthodox Church. It was a whole network. When I saw some of the sort of video output they put out, it was very powerful. It was an anti-colonial. It was ironic because it was all funded by America and Spain, and probably some Britain, but it was a very powerful anti-colonial. This is it's the global North trying to impose these anti-African values. So. I think we've also got to think about that. Just a final thing, practically, I'm going to go away for this, I'm going to learn more, and Jason's going to help me about the Privy Council and other things, and I'm going to raise questions when Parliament is reassembled after the election. On the media front, I've actually been talking to people last few months about, what do we do in terms of the media narrative? Are there platforms where we around them and have our own sort of media? But how do we ensure that doesn't become just dominated by people like me? So, that's an ongoing conversation which I'd sort of like to take on. But I think those are sort of four areas that are really necessary.
I wonder if I could add one in for you. And this was something that Lord Cashman said in the House of Lords about targeted sanctions. I think large sanctions against the country as a whole will be seen as that narrative of the white people trying to force a gay agenda down black people's throats. Whereas targeted sanctions against the parliamentarians themselves who are bringing these laws in their parliaments would work. Most of these parliamentarians in East Africa, their kids go to university out here.
Yeah.
Ban them. Don't let them come to universities if their parents are passing anti-gay legislation back home. If they have bank accounts in these countries, shut them down. Deny them visas to travel. Target the people bringing these laws, and you will see them change their song very quickly.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think that's, again, something that mentioned in her video about targeting the lawmakers bringing in these laws, because then you will see that they have received X amount of money from the lobbying group a year, 2, 3 years prior to them bringing this law into their parliament. And again, like you said, like everyone has said, if you follow the money, you'll see who are the co-conspirators in the West and who are the ones sort of bringing it to parliament across Africa, and then who's going to benefit from it, because a lot of this leads to either groups being marginalized or areas being destabilized for other Western companies to either seize control or seize control of the mineral within that area, or seize control of the narrative. Because I think people fail to realize that when you have control of the narrative, you can control how people vote, you can control who people vote for, you can control how people view themselves, and you can almost sometimes even predict civil war happening or stoke civil wars or genocides, like we saw that happen in Nigeria with the Biafra, like we saw happen in Rwanda with the Tutsis and Hutu. So fighting on all fronts, like everyone has said, requires a lot of money, a lot of time, but also us coming together as a community with our eyes to do what is needed to be done. So, you know, what we came here to do is have a conversation, have a discussion, and pull together ideas to bring to Parliament. It'd be great just to find out how the process and how that actually works.
Well, it depends a bit about what you want to achieve, and so there's many different mechanisms, issues before Parliament. There's white papers which are government setting out a policy direction. There's sanctions regimes. If you're looking for sort of regimes against oppressive individuals, there's obviously diplomatic pressure, and Parliament can play a role in pressing our ministers to act on that. And table questions which raise profile. I mean, one of the things that I've done, I always check before I raise any of these issues, whether it's about LGBT plus issues or indeed any human rights issues, I always check with the people involved or their families that it is going to be not counterproductive. But often raising an issue in Parliament where somebody is in prison and suffering, torture or very bad conditions, or potentially where people's lives are under threat, raising it in Parliament can raise the price of government actually treating that person badly. And we've got some good examples where conditions have improved because governments have realised it's not cost-free to oppress people. But I'm always conscious that you've got to be careful about that, and it's counterproductive. So that's one of the things. We Parliament host meetings with ministers, roundtables, etc., to get these issues on the agenda. One of the things that's really, I think, important to understand about Parliament, and particularly about people in ministerial positions and the people who can actually make decisions, is they very often do not know about the issues we care about passionately, and that we think everybody should know about, but they often don't. I often find myself, why meetings like this are so useful, I often myself, learning huge amounts, which is then helps inform me. We can write letters, we can ask for meetings with ministers. So there's a whole range of issues. We can seek to change the law, if the British law, obviously, if that's relevant.
Perfect, thank you. Excellent. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Nware Emenike. I am a proud first-generation Nigerian immigrant. I'm queer, I'm here, get used to it.